The morning Susan Thatcher carried her wedding quilt to the Millhaven market, she told herself she was not crying. It was only the wind, sharp and unforgiving off the Kansas plains, that made her eyes water so fiercely as she walked. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Millhaven sat like a sun-bleached bone on the open prairie of southern Kansas, the kind of place that had sprung up fast around a railroad spur and a water tower, full of promise and dust, and men who talked too loud in the saloon on Saturday nights. The streets were packed dirt, the buildings mostly raw timber that had never seen a lick of paint, and the wind came through every crack and gap as though the whole territory resented having walls put up inside it. Susan had lived in Millhaven for 6 years, arriving as a young bride of 22 with her husband Daniel Thatcher, and she had watched the town grow from a cluster of tents and wagons to something almost resembling permanence. Now, at 28, she was watching it from the outside of that permanence, the way a person watches a warm fire through a cold window. Daniel had been dead for 8 months. A fever, the doctor had called it, though Susan suspected it was also exhaustion and heartache, and the slow erosion of a man ground down by bad harvests and harder luck. He had died in September, just before the corn could be brought in, and Susan had harvested what she could with the help of her 2 boys and her neighbor Marta Hollies, but it had not been enough. It was never enough. The winter had been brutal, the kind that killed cattle and cracked the iron pump handle right off the well casing, and Susan had burned furniture for heat and rationed cornmeal with the precision of a woman who understood that mathematics, in her situation, was the difference between her sons eating or going hungry. Her sons. Jacob was 9 years old, serious and watchful, with Daniel's dark eyes and the habit of chewing his lower lip when he was thinking hard. Thomas was 6, round-cheeked and loud and prone to laughter at the wrong moments, but also the kind of child who would press himself against his mother's side at night and say her name very quietly, the way a small creature checks to be sure its shelter is still standing. Susan loved them both with a ferocity that sometimes frightened her. It was a love sharp enough to cut, and it had gotten her out of bed every single morning since Daniel had died, even the mornings when she could not imagine any particular reason to rise. The quilt had been a wedding gift from her mother. Eleanor Marsh had pieced it together over the winter before Susan's marriage, working by lamplight after the rest of the family was asleep, cutting hexagons from the good dresses and Sunday shirts of Susan's girlhood, stitching them into a pattern of overlapping flowers that her mother had called grandmother's flower garden. The colors were faded now, the lavender and the yellow and the deep rose, but they were still there, still recognizable, still full of the particular kind of memory that a person can feel in their hands when they touch the cloth. Susan's mother had died 2 years after the wedding, and the quilt was the last thing made entirely of her mother's intention and care. It was the last object in Susan's house that still smelled, faintly, when held close to the face, of the cedar chest it had traveled in from Missouri. She had lain awake for 3 nights before deciding to sell it. She had turned the decision over and over in the dark, next to the cold space where Daniel used to sleep, listening to Thomas cough with the remnant of a winter chest cold, and hearing Jacob get up quietly in the small hours to add wood to the stove without being asked. That sound, her 9-year-old son tending the fire in the night so his mother could sleep, had made the decision for her. She was down to $4.30 in the tin box under the floorboard. The dry goods account at Heckett's store had been extended twice and could not be extended again. The boys needed shoes before summer made itself felt, and shoes cost money, and the quilt was the only thing she owned that anyone would pay real money to buy. She laid it across her arms as she walked, the way one carries something one does not want to drop, and the wind tried to take the edges and she held them firmly, and she walked the half-mile from her house on the edge of town to the square, where the Saturday market was held every week from late spring through early autumn. When the ranchers and farmers and travelers came together to trade and sell and buy and gossip and argue in the particular good-natured way of people who did not see each other often enough to run out of things to say. The market had been running for 2 hours by the time Susan arrived, having left Jacob in charge of Thomas, and the house with instructions to eat the remaining corn porridge for breakfast and not to fight. The square was loud and lively with the smell of leather and wood smoke and horse and fresh bread from the bakery that Nell Carpenter ran out of a wagon on market days. Susan found an open space along the east fence and spread a length of burlap on the ground and laid the quilt on top of it, smoothing the edges with her palms, and then she stood back and tried to think of how to present a thing she could barely look at without her chest clenching tight. She priced it at $3. It was worth more, she knew that. The workmanship was fine, the stitching tight, and even the pattern elegant. Her mother had been the best quilter in Caldwell County, Missouri, and this was her mother's masterwork. $3 was a low price, and Susan knew it, but she needed to sell it today, not in 2 weeks when some canny buyer decided the price was right, and she had learned enough about the hard economy of need to understand that desperation was a commodity that commanded discounts. The morning wore on. People came and looked and sometimes touched the edge of the quilt and said things like it was very fine work or asked who had made it, and Susan answered their questions with a steady voice and a face that she kept carefully composed. A woman named Dora Hutchins from the Hutchins Ranch spent a long time examining the stitching and finally said she might have offered 2 1/4, and Susan said the price was $3, and Dora Hutchins moved on without buying. A couple of the other market women gave Susan the kind of look that is not quite pity but sits in the same neighborhood, and Susan returned those looks with a pleasant expression and went back to watching the square. Amos Bailey rode into Millhaven that Saturday morning with no particular plan beyond restocking his supplies, having his horse reshod at the blacksmith's, and perhaps sitting somewhere quiet with a cup of decent coffee before the long ride back to the Bailey Ranch, which sat 15 miles northeast of town, and was, at this particular moment, the loneliest piece of land in southern Kansas as far as Amos was concerned. He was 34 years old, which in 1878 was not young but was not old, though there were mornings when he got out of bed and his back disagreed with that assessment. He had come to Kansas 7 years ago from Tennessee, following a brother who had since moved on to Colorado, and he had stayed because the land had gotten into him the way land does when you have worked it long enough with your own hands. He ran cattle, some 400 head, and kept a small crew of 3 ranch hands, Pete Dunham, Cisco Rays, and a young man everyone called Rafter for reasons that predated Amos's arrival on the ranch, and that no one had ever adequately explained. The ranch was productive enough, modestly profitable in the good years, manageable in the bad ones. Amos was not a wealthy man, but he was not a struggling one, and he understood the difference was largely a matter of weather and luck, and the number of mouths you had to feed. He had been married once. Clara had died in childbirth in 1874, along with the baby, a boy, and Amos had spent the years since working the ranch with the kind of focused, relentless activity that is another name for grief when grief has nowhere else to go. He was not a man who talked about his feelings, being of that particular generation and temperament that considered silence on personal matters a form of dignity. But anyone who knew him could see the shape of what had happened to him in the way he moved through a room, and the way he went quiet sometimes in the middle of conversations, as though he had momentarily left the present and gone somewhere else, somewhere private and painful, and then come back. He tied his horse at the rail near the market square and went first to the blacksmith, leaving the animal in capable hands, and then walked the market in the easy, unhurried way of a man who has nowhere pressing to be. He bought flour and salt and dried beans and a tin of coffee, and he was talking to Tom Greer about the price of hay when he saw the quilt. It was the colors that caught him first. In the general atmosphere of brown and gray, and sun faded everything that characterized the market and the town and the plains themselves. Those hexagons of lavender and rose and yellow and deep green jumped out at him with a kind of visual insistence, like flowers after rain. He stopped mid-sentence, which caused Tom Greer to look at him strangely, and then he said, "Excuse me a moment," and walked toward the east fence. The woman standing beside the quilt was looking somewhere else, her attention directed toward the far end of the square, and he had a moment to observe her before she noticed him. She was tall for a woman, fine-boned, with dark auburn hair that was pinned up beneath a plain gray bonnet, but escaped in wisps around her face in the way hair does when the wind has opinions. She was wearing a dark dress that had been mended at the left cuff and the hem, mended neatly and carefully, which told him something. Her hands were folded in front of her and her back was straight, and there was something in the set of her jaw, something composed and deliberate, that told him she was working hard at the expression on her face. He looked at the quilt. He looked at her face. He put those two things together with a rancher's instinct for reading a situation, and he felt something in his chest that was quieter and sadder and more complicated than what he usually felt. "Is this quilt for sale?" he asked, though the small handwritten card beside it was perfectly legible. She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were green, a dark and complicated green like the deep grass in a good spring, and there were shadows under them that spoke of poor sleep and sustained worry. "It is," she said. Her voice was steady and clear. $3. He crouched down to look at the work more closely, which was not entirely performance. It was genuinely fine quilting, the hexagons precisely cut and the stitching meticulous, the kind of work that took long hours and patience and real skill. He turned up one corner carefully and looked at the back. "This is handsome work," he said. "Who made it?" "My mother," she said, after a pause that was very short but which he noticed. "She made it for my wedding." He did not say anything to that. He let the words sit where they had landed and stood back up and looked at her directly. "Amos Bailey," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "Susan Thatcher," she said, with the automatic courtesy of someone who had been raised to be polite even when she did not feel like it. "You're out on the Prater Road, aren't you?" he said. "The farm with the red barn." She looked at him with a slight measured surprise. "I am. Did you know my husband?" "Only by sight," he said. "I ride through that way sometimes. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Thatcher." "Thank you," she said, and the composed expression she'd been maintaining shifted slightly, fractionally, as though something behind it moved, and then she had it back in place. "It was last September." "I know," he said quietly. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable exactly but was full of things neither of them said. Amos looked at the quilt again. He thought about the wedding it had been made for and the wedding it had outlasted, and he thought about the woman standing next to it in her mended dress and her carefully maintained composure, and he reached into his coat pocket and took out $3. "I'll take it," he said. She looked at the money and then at him. "You are certain about the price?" "More than certain," he said. "It's worth more than that." She took the money and her hands were steady as she counted it, but he noticed she did not look at the quilt as she folded it and handed it to him. She handed it across like it was a piece of yard goods she had no attachment to, and the effort that small performance cost her was visible only in the way she immediately looked somewhere else afterward, directing her gaze out across the busy square with fixed attention, as though something there required her urgent watching. "Thank you for your business, Mr. Bailey," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Thatcher," he said. He carried the quilt to his horse, draped it over the pommel, and stood there for a moment with one hand on the saddle and the other resting on the folded cloth. He could feel the quality of it even through the wrapping of his own thoughts. He stood there long enough that Pete Dunham, who had come to town with him, and who was currently leaning against the water trough 20 feet away eating an apple with the boneless ease of a man who had nothing on his mind, looked over and said, "You doing all right, boss?" "Fine," Amos said, "I'm fine." But he rode home that afternoon thinking about Susan Thatcher's face when she handed him the quilt, and the mended cuffs on her dress, and the way she had said, "My mother made it for my wedding," with all the grief she thought she had hidden and hadn't. The ranch was quiet when he got back. Cisco had the supper fire going, and Rafter was patching a section of fence near the barn, and the cattle were grazing on the far slope in the gold late afternoon light. Amos put his horse up, stored his supplies, and then sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and the quilt laid out across the table in front of him, and he looked at it for a long time. He thought about Clara. He thought about the things that outlast people, the physical objects that absorb their time and their care, and then remain in the world after the people are gone. He thought about Susan Thatcher and the tin she probably kept under a floorboard, the way all women in her situation kept their money under a floorboard, and the boys she was feeding on whatever that tin contained, and the empty space in her bed and the empty space in her family that no amount of careful composure could fill in. He made a decision somewhere around the third cup of coffee, the way some decisions get made, not in a blaze of feeling but quietly, like a door closing on a draft. He rose before 4 in the morning. The sky was still fully dark, salted with stars the way a Kansas sky gets in the small hours when there is no moon, and the air had the deep cold of early spring nights that makes you understand why frost can still come in May. He saddled his horse without lighting a lamp, doing it by feel and familiarity, and he strapped the quilt behind the cantle and rode out from the ranch into the darkness. The 15 miles to town took a little under 2 hours at an easy trot, and he arrived in Millhaven somewhere around 5:30 in the morning, when the sky was the color of a bruise turning, the first light not yet risen, but the absolute dark already giving way to something that was almost gray. The town was silent. The saloon was dark and its door was closed, which was notable in itself. The bakery's chimney was just beginning to show smoke. A dog barked once at the far end of the street and then went quiet. He found the farm on the Prater Road without difficulty. The red barn was darker red in the pre-dawn, the farmhouse a modest structure of timber and limestone, a kitchen garden taking shape in the first light along the south wall, a clothesline running from the porch post to a wooden stake where a child's shirt and 2 pairs of trousers hung in the still air. He rode to the gate, dismounted quietly, and opened it with the care of a man who does not want to make a sound. He walked the horse inside and tied it to the fence post, and he lifted the quilt down from behind the saddle. He stood at the gate with the quilt folded in his arms and he looked at the house. The windows were dark. He could hear very faintly the sound of a child breathing in sleep through the cracked window of what he guessed was the boy's room. He walked up the path to the front door, which was a Dutch door, the top and bottom halves separate, both latched but not locked. He set the quilt down on the porch boards in front of the door, folded neat as something carefully packed, and then he stood there for a moment in the cold dawn with his hat in his hands. He thought about leaving a note and didn't. He thought about knocking and didn't. He put his hat back on, turned around, walked back down the path, untied his horse, and rode back toward Millhaven in the growing light. He was 2 miles down the road before the sun actually broke the horizon, and the plains went gold all around him in the particular extravagant way of Kansas mornings, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that was quieter than happiness but wider, the way a field looks wider when the light is right. Susan came downstairs at 6 o'clock in the morning because Thomas had appeared at her bedroom door with his hair in complete disorder, and the announcement that he was hungry, which was not news. She built up the stove and put water on for the oats, and she was braiding her hair when Jacob came in from outside with his face arranged in the expression of determined neutrality he wore when something had surprised him and he did not want to show it. "Mama," he said, "there's something on the porch." She followed him out, her braid half finished, and she stood on the porch in the cold morning air and looked down at the quilt folded on the boards in front of her door. She stood very still for a long moment. She crouched down and touched the top fold, and the fabric was there under her fingers, the lavender hexagons, the rose, the yellow, and she recognized it the way you recognize something that has been part of your life long enough to be inseparable from it. the way you recognize your own heartbeat." She picked it up and held it against her chest, and she did not cry, which took more effort than Jacob or Thomas could have known. She turned it over, looked at it from every angle, and there was no note, no card, no explanation. Just the quilt, folded with care, left on her doorstep in the dark before sunrise. "Do you know who left it?" Jacob asked. "I have a guess," Susan said quietly. She carried it inside and spread it on the kitchen table and stood looking at it while Thomas ate his oats, and the house felt different with it there, less empty, which was an irrational thing to feel about a piece of cloth, but she felt it nonetheless. Amos Bailey, she thought. She did not know the man. She knew his name and that he had a ranch 15 miles northeast, and that he had kind eyes and a deliberate way of moving that suggested a person who thought before he acted. She knew that he had paid $3 for her wedding quilt without flinching, and without asking why she was selling it, which meant he either knew or had guessed, and that he had brought it back before sunrise without leaving his name, which meant he was the kind of man who did good things without needing credit for them. That was not a common variety of man. She had known enough of the other kind to appreciate the distinction. She folded the quilt and placed it at the foot of her bed, and she went about her day, the feeding and watering of the chickens, the repair of the garden fence where a rabbit had gotten through, the washing, the cooking, the endless management of the small practical world that kept 2 children alive. But Amos Bailey stayed in the back of her mind like a song you have heard once and can't entirely put down. The following Saturday she went back to the market. She had not planned to speak to him specifically. She had planned to buy flour and eggs, and perhaps the bolt of lightweight cotton she needed to make Thomas a summer shirt, and she had planned to do this and go home. But she had thought, in the back of her honest mind, that he might be there. Men who came to market on a Saturday had a tendency to come back the following Saturday, it being a routine rather than an event. He was there. She saw him before he saw her, standing at Tom Greer's stall talking about horses, or so it appeared from the gestures involved. She bought her flour and she bought her eggs, and she was examining the bolt of cotton when she heard his boots on the boards of the walkway behind her, and she turned. He stopped when he saw her. He touched his hat. "Mrs. Thatcher." "Mr. Bailey," she said. She looked at him steadily with the green eyes that had surprised him the first time. "I believe I owe you something." He looked confused for just a moment, which was a more honest expression than he usually wore. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean," she said carefully, "that someone left my quilt on my doorstep before sunrise last Saturday morning, and I believe that person was you, and I would like to return the $3. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Keep your money, Mrs. Thatcher." "I can't do that." "You can and you should." His voice was steady, not aggressive, just plain. "I bought a quilt. I had a change of heart about keeping it. There's nothing owed." "That is a very peculiar way of framing a kindness," she said. He looked at her, and there was a small thing that was almost a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I don't do kindnesses, Mrs. Thatcher. I do business." "Then it was very strange business," she said, and she was looking at him with something that was close to warmth, something she was not entirely accustomed to feeling in the direction of a man who was not Daniel. "Thank you," she said, more quietly. "The quilt was my mother's. I would have regretted selling it for the rest of my life." He was quiet again, the way he went quiet sometimes. Then he said, "I know. I could see that when you handed it to me." There was a moment between them, the kind of moment that does not announce itself, but that both people register somewhere below conscious thought. Then Thomas's voice came shrieking from 20 feet away because he had apparently upset the egg basket, and Susan turned, and the moment ended. And she spent the next 5 minutes reassembling eggs from the dirt while Thomas explained, at some volume, that it had not been his fault. When she looked up, Amos Bailey was there beside her, crouching in the dirt with one big hand carefully cradling an egg that had rolled against the fence post. He held it out to her. It was unbroken. "Thank you," she said. "This your boy." He looked at Thomas, who had gone abruptly shy in the presence of an adult male stranger, which was notable because Thomas was not in general a shy child. "Thomas," she said. "He's 6. My other son Jacob is 9. He stayed home today." Amos looked at Thomas with the direct, unembarrassed attention of a man who had been around children enough not to feel awkward around them, even if he didn't have any of his own. "Thomas," he said, "you ever been on a horse?" Thomas looked at his mother, then back at Amos. "Yes, sir," he said, with the dignity of someone reclaiming authority he feels he has temporarily lost. "Good," said Amos, with the small, almost smile again. They walked back through the market together for a little while, which was not exactly planned but was not accidental either, and they talked about the spring and the planting season and the state of the roads and several other innocuous subjects. And Susan noticed that he did not ask about Daniel and did not avoid the subject of him either, which was a balance she appreciated. He mentioned the ranch, the number of cattle, the new foal one of his mares had dropped that week, and he mentioned it without boasting, the way a man talks about work he finds genuinely satisfying. She mentioned her kitchen garden and the fence that needed proper repair, not the patch job she'd done, and he said, without making it into a charitable gesture, "I'll be riding that way next week. I could take a look at it if you like." She considered him. She was a woman who had learned to be careful, and she was also a woman who was honest with herself about the limits of her own strength and capability, and the fence genuinely needed repair beyond what she could accomplish with a hand drill and leftover wire. That would be welcome, she said. He came the following Wednesday. He arrived in the late morning with 2 fence posts strapped to his pack horse and a tool roll in his saddlebag, and a canvas sack that she didn't ask about, and he walked the garden fence line first, examining where the rabbit had gotten through, and where the frost heave had shifted the posts, and where the wire had rusted thin. He worked steadily and without needing direction, which she appreciated, because she had enough to direct without adding a grown man to the list. Jacob watched him from a distance at first, from the barn door with his arms crossed and his expression carefully evaluating, as 9-year-old boys do when a new adult appears in their domestic landscape. Amos did not make any effort to draw Jacob in or to be excessively friendly, which Susan noticed. He just worked, and after about an hour Jacob drifted closer, and then was standing beside the fence, and then was handing tools when they were needed, and then was talking about the rabbits that had been getting into the garden all winter and the particular strategy he had developed for discouraging them, which involved a length of string and some dried lavender, and a theory about rabbits disliking lavender that Jacob had developed independently, and which may or may not have had any scientific basis. Amos listened to this theory with apparent seriousness, and said he had not tried lavender and might try it himself. Thomas, less cautious than his brother and operating on different instincts entirely, had attached himself to Amos within 40 minutes of his arrival, and was now perched on the fence post watching every hammer stroke with the solemn intensity of an apprentice. Susan brought out cold water and corn bread at midday, and they sat on the porch steps in the sunshine, the 4 of them, and it was the kind of simple pleasantness that she had not felt in so long that it actually hurt a little, the way light hurts eyes that have grown accustomed to the dark. She found herself watching Amos Bailey's hands as he drank his water, large, capable hands, calloused and scarred in the small ways that come from years of working with wire and wood and iron. She found herself watching the way he listened when Jacob talked, the quality of his attention. She found herself noticing that he was not a handsome man in any obvious way, his face weather-worn and angular, a scar along his jaw from some old event she didn't know, but that he had a quality that was more useful than handsomeness, which was the quality of being genuinely present in a conversation, of making the person he was speaking to feel that what they were saying was the most important thing currently happening in the world. "You have a good piece of land here," he said, looking out at the fields. "It was Daniel's land," she said. "He broke it himself." "I know," Amos said, and then quietly, "It'll hold." She looked at him sideways. "The land will hold." "I'm less certain about the rest of it." "What rest of it?" She was quiet for a moment. "The mortgage comes due in October. There were 2 bad harvests before Daniel died and one after. I can make the payment if this season's corn comes in and if I can find work between now and then, but the margin is very small." She said this plainly, without emotion, because it was a practical fact and she was a practical woman, and she had decided, somewhere in the course of the fence repair and the cornbread, that she could be honest with Amos Bailey. He had that effect on her, that directness that invited directness in return. He did not make soothing sounds or offer empty reassurances. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Do you know how to keep accounts?" She looked at him. "I managed Daniel's farm books for 5 years. I need someone to do the accounts for the ranch," he said. "My handwriting is criminal and my arithmetic is adequate but not inspired. I could pay a fair rate. You could do it from here. I'd bring the books each week." She studied him. "Is that a real offer or a charitable one?" "It's a real offer," he said, meeting her eyes. "I've been meaning to find someone for that work for 2 years. My previous solution was Pete Dunham, who is an excellent cattleman and a genuinely terrible accountant." She looked out at the fields and then back at him. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded, as though thinking about it was a reasonable and complete answer, and went back to the fence. She thought about it for 2 days and then sent Jacob to the Bailey ranch with a note that said she accepted the work. Amos sent back a brief note in the handwriting he had described as criminal. It was not that bad, she thought, just large and impatient, saying he would bring the books on Friday. He brought the books on Friday and stayed for supper, which had been Jacob's suggestion, made with the direct pragmatism of a child who has decided he approves of someone and sees no reason to be subtle about it. Susan had made rabbit stew, because Jacob's lavender strategy notwithstanding there were still rabbits, and biscuits, and Amos ate with the appetite of a man who had been cooking his own meals for a long time and was not going to pretend otherwise. The conversation at the table was easy, moving from cattle to corn to the new schoolteacher who had arrived in Millhaven last month and whose name was Miss Prescott, and who was, according to Jacob, surprisingly strict about arithmetic but also very fair. After supper, Amos sat at the kitchen table and went through the ranch books with Susan, explaining the cattle tallies and the feed costs and the irregular notations that Pete Dunham had made in a handwriting that was, she had to agree, genuinely difficult. She asked precise questions and he gave precise answers, and by the end of 2 hours she had a clear picture of the ranch's finances, and Amos had a clear picture of the fact that she was exceptionally good with numbers. "You should have been a bookkeeper," he said, as she was making final notations. "My father didn't think girls needed more schooling than they got," she said, without particular bitterness. "But my mother taught me her way." "Your mother sounds like she was a formidable woman." "She was," Susan said. She looked down at the page. "She was the kind of person who makes everything around her a little better by being in it. Those are the people you miss most, I think." He was quiet. Then he said, "Yes, I think so too." She looked up at him then, and she could see it in his face, the echo of his own loss, and she understood in that moment that he was not a man who was undamaged. He was a man who had learned to carry his damage with a kind of dignified practicality, and she recognized that because she was learning to do the same thing. "You had a wife," she said. It was not a question. "Clara," he said, 4 years ago." "I'm sorry," she said. "I know," he said, and that was all, but it was enough. They fell into a pattern after that, the way people do when the pattern suits both of them. He came on Fridays with the ranch books, stayed for supper, talked to the boys about cattle and horses and the particular small dramas of ranch life that Jacob found fascinating and Thomas found enthralling, and then rode back in the evening. Susan did the accounts on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, before the day got too busy, and she began to look forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays in a way that she told herself was purely professional, being that the work engaged her mind and kept her off the mortgage calculation that she would otherwise be running over and over in her head. But she looked forward to Fridays too, and the professional explanation did not entirely reach that far. He was careful with her. She noticed this. He was a man who understood the difference between a widow with children and a woman in a simpler situation, and he moved in her direction with a patience and a lack of pressure that she could only recognize as deliberate kindness. He did not flirt. He did not make implications. He did not put her in any position that required her to define anything. He simply appeared on Fridays, ate her cooking, talked to her boys, and looked at her sometimes with those steady dark eyes in a way that she found herself thinking about later, lying in bed with the quilt over her. The quilt now spread permanently over her bed, where it belonged, thinking about the way he looked at her, and what it might mean, and what she might feel about it if she let herself look at that honestly. June came and brought heat, and the corn began to rise, and the kitchen garden filled out with the particular exuberance of Kansas summer, and Susan began to relax incrementally, the way a body does when a sustained threat begins to recede. The accounting work brought in enough to cover the small things, shoes for both boys, a new axe handle. The dry goods account at Heckett's brought back to zero and kept there. Not wealth, not comfort, but solvency, and solvency in the summer of 1878 felt to Susan Thatcher like a very great luxury. Thomas announced one Friday in June, with no apparent awareness that this might be a notable statement, that Amos was his best friend. Jacob received this claim with the tolerant superiority of an older brother, but Amos, who was tightening a loose board on the porch steps when Thomas made this announcement, went still for a moment and then said, gravely and without any teasing, "That means a great deal to me, Thomas." Thomas nodded, as though this was the appropriate and expected response, and went back to examining the frog he had found in the rain barrel. That evening after supper, the boys were in bed and Susan was washing the dishes and Amos was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, and he said, not looking up from the cup, "Do you ever have any help here? With the work, I mean. Anyone coming by regularly?" "Marta Hollis comes Wednesday morning," Susan said. "We trade. I do her mending, she helps with the washing, and Jacob is very capable for his age." "He is," Amos agreed. "He's a good boy." "He is," Susan said. She dried a plate and set it on the shelf. "He worries too much. He's been worrying since Daniel died. He carries things that aren't his to carry." "He's trying to fill a space," Amos said. She turned from the shelf and looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what he's doing." There was a pause, the comfortable kind. Outside, the night crickets were loud and sustained, and somewhere off on the plains a coyote was making its opinion known about something. "You could let him off that duty sometime," Amos said carefully, "if you had someone else to carry it." She went very still at the wash basin. He was looking at his coffee cup. His jaw was set in a way that suggested this had cost him something to say. "I'm not saying it well," he added. "No," she said quietly. "You're saying it clearly enough." Silence. The crickets. The coyote. "I have thought," she said slowly, choosing words with the precision of a woman who has learned that imprecision causes problems, "that you are the steadiest person I have met in a long time, and that when you are in this house it is a different house." She paused. "I don't say that lightly." He looked up at her then. "I know you don't. I am also," she continued, "a woman with 2 children and a mortgage and no certainty about the future, and I do not need rescuing. I need a person who understands the difference." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not interested in rescuing you. I'm interested in you." The bluntness of it caught her and she felt her breath change slightly, the way it changes when you have been bracing for something and the thing comes from an unexpected angle. She looked at him, this weathered, quiet, careful man who had bought her quilt and brought it back and fixed her fence and kept her accounts and sat at her table every Friday evening for 2 months. And she thought about Clara, the wife who had died, and Daniel, the husband who had died, and the fact that loss does not mean the end of wanting. "I think," she said, "that I should like it very much if you went on coming to supper." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I plan to." It was not a declaration, and it was not a proposal, and it was not a romantic speech. It was the plainest possible statement, made by a plain man who meant exactly what he said, and Susan Thatcher felt it settle into her chest like something that had been cold for a very long time being given warmth. July came like a furnace on the plains. The cattle required constant attention in the heat, and Amos was busier than usual during the week, but Fridays were inviolable. He never missed. Through the hottest part of the summer he came every Friday, and Susan began to be less careful about the things she let herself feel. The way you become less careful about a door once you know it opens into a good room. They walked the farm together one Friday evening after supper, when the heat had lifted enough to make the outdoors bearable, and the boys were doing their evening chores. It was the blue hour between sunset and dark, the sky going from orange to violet above the flat horizon, and the corn was up above Susan's waist now, the stalks rustling in the evening wind. They walked along the corn row without touching, and Amos talked about the variety she had planted, and whether the soil in the far field was getting enough drainage. And Susan talked about what Daniel had planted and what she had changed and why, and it was a thoroughly agricultural conversation. But somewhere in it, Amos put his hand out and steadied her as she stepped over a furrow, and his hand stayed at her elbow for a moment after she was steady, and she did not move away from it. "Tell me about Clara," she said. She had been wondering when to say this, had been holding it carefully for a while. He was quiet for a few steps. The corn moved around them. "She was small," he said. "About this high." He indicated a height that was considerably shorter than Susan. "She talked more than I did, which wasn't hard. She had a laugh you could hear from the south pasture. She was from Indiana, and she had very decided opinions about how things should be done, and she was usually right about them." He paused. "She would have been a good mother." "I'm sorry," Susan said. "I was angry for a long time," he said. I was angry at everything. The land, the distance from town, the doctor who hadn't gotten there in time, at God for the arrangement of the world." He said it simply, without drama. "The anger wore out eventually. These things do, I think, if you stay alive long enough and keep working." "The grief doesn't wear out," Susan said. "No," he agreed. "That changes shape, but it doesn't wear out." They had stopped walking without deciding to stop, standing at the edge of the cornfield with the last orange light on the horizon and the first stars coming out. And he turned to look at her, and she was looking up at him. And in the blue evening light she was very beautiful, with the escaped strands of hair around her face and the steady green eyes. And he did something that surprised him almost as much as it surprised her, which was that he took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with any particular declaration. He just took her hand the way you take hold of something you have been reaching toward for a while, and she let him have it, and they stood there in the edge of the cornfield for a moment with the night coming in and the stars multiplying overhead, and it was the most Susan Thatcher had felt in 8 months, maybe longer than that, and she squeezed his hand once and he squeezed back, and they walked back to the house without talking. Jacob was waiting on the porch. He looked at his mother, and then at Amos with the particular, studied neutrality of a 9-year-old who has observed more than he's letting on, and then he said, "Thomas left the chicken coop latch open again." "I'll tell him," Susan said. Amos crouched down in front of Jacob with his arms resting on his knees, and he said, "You did a good job on the fence along the south side. I noticed it's been mended." Jacob stood a little straighter. "The wire was coming loose." "It was. You fixed it right." He looked at the boy steadily. "You're a good farmer, Jacob." Jacob, who had been carrying the weight of an unasked question for 2 months, looked at Amos for a long moment and then said, in the direct way of someone who has decided to be direct, "Are you going to keep coming here?" "If your mother will have me," Amos said. Jacob looked at his mother. Susan looked at her son with all the love she had for him, and all the things she could not quite say about the future, which was still uncertain, and she said, "I think that's between Mr. Bailey and me, Jacob." "Then yes," Jacob said, with the absolute certainty of someone who has already decided the answer and is merely confirming it. Amos stood up, and there was that almost smile, deeper this time. "Good," he said. "The corn came in well in September. Not a bumper crop, but solid, and the prices were fair at the grain elevator. And Susan made the mortgage payment in October with 2 weeks to spare and $30 remaining in the tin. which was not wealth, but was a margin she could breathe against. She stood at the bank counter after paying and felt the particular quiet triumph of a woman who has held something together through sheer sustained effort. And she thought of Daniel, and she thought of her mother, and she let herself feel proud without apology. Amos heard about the mortgage payment from her the following Friday, and he said, quietly and with genuine feeling, "I'm glad." "I'm more than glad," she said. "I'm grateful." The accounting work made the difference. She looked at him directly. You knew it would. He did not deny it. He looked back at her with the steady, dark eyes and said, "I needed the accounts done. That was true. That was not the only reason you offered it." "No," he said, "it wasn't." They were standing in her kitchen in the October afternoon light, which came in the south window at an angle that turned everything warm. And the house smelled of the beef stew on the stove, and the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, and the cedar of the old chest in the corner. And Amos Bailey was looking at her with something open and direct in his expression that she had not seen him allow before. And Susan felt the thing in her chest that she had been letting grow all summer arrive at a clarity that she could not pretend was something else. She stepped toward him, which took something, because she was a woman who had spent 8 months being the only person in the room who was going to take care of anything, and stepping toward someone else was an act of trust that did not come easily. But she stepped, and he was there, and he put his arms around her with the careful certainty of a man who had thought about this and was not going to fumble it, and she put her forehead against his chest and breathed. Just that. Just stood there with her forehead against his chest and breathed. His chin came down against the top of her head. His arms were solid and warm and completely still, not demanding, just present, the way he was always present, and she thought distantly that she had not been held since the last morning of Daniel's life when he was still well enough to be held, which was 11 months ago, and that she had not let herself know how much she had missed it until this exact moment. "Amos," she said into his shirt. "I'm here," he said quietly. That was November of 1878. By December, the Friday suppers had become assumed, and Amos had begun appearing on Wednesdays as well, ostensibly for various practical reasons. A gate that needed rehinging, a section of roof that had started to show ice damp, the horses that needed checking over. Susan accepted these pretexts without comment because the pretexts were not the point and they both knew it. The point was that the house was a different house when he was in it, and the evenings were different, and Jacob had stopped carrying the weight of a man in a small boy's body, and Thomas had begun calling him Amos like they had always known each other, which they had, in the particular sense that matters. Christmas came and went. Amos spent Christmas Day at the farm, which had been the boys' suggestion, presented to their mother in the combined force of a 2-person petition, though it was Thomas who did the actual speaking and Jacob who provided the moral weight of silent agreement behind him. Susan had been going to suggest it anyway, and was only slightly annoyed at being preempted by a 6-year-old. Amos brought a length of good wool cloth for Susan, and a pair of carved wooden horses for Thomas, and a book of surveying and map-making for Jacob, which Jacob received with such concentrated delight that he barely spoke for the rest of the morning. The winter was cold but not brutal, the way the previous one had been, and there was a steadiness to the season that Susan had not experienced since before Daniel's illness began. She kept the accounts, kept the garden, kept the house, kept her boys doing their lessons and their chores, and every Wednesday and every Friday the sound of a horse on the Prater Road at the right time of day made something in her ease that had been tensed. She and Amos talked through those months in a way that she had not talked to anyone in a long time, not since she and Daniel were young, and the world still felt like something you could plan against. They talked about the land and the territory and the way Kansas was changing, the railroads bringing more people every year, the cattle drives that were gradually shifting westward as the land in the east was cultivated. They talked about the injustice of how homesteaders were often pitted against the big cattle interests, how the open-range laws favored the men who had come first with the most money, and how the men who came later with only their own hands and will found the margins tight and the courts unsympathetic. They talked about the exodusters, the black homesteaders who had come to Kansas seeking the freedom the East had promised and then complicated. And Amos said, with a plainness that she appreciated, that a man deserved the fruit of his own labor regardless of anything else, and that he had employed Cisco Rays for 7 years because he was the best judge of cattle Amos had ever known, and he had never understood the arithmetic of deciding what a man was worth by anything other than what he could do. Daniel felt the same, Susan said. He hired 2 men over the years, one from Mexico and one was the son of a freedman. The town had things to say about it. The town has things to say about everything, Amos said. He didn't care, Susan said. I loved that about him. He was very certain about what was right. She had not talked about what she had loved about Daniel before, not to Amos, and she felt the shift in herself as she said it, the ability to say it without pain taking over, to say it as a fact about a man she had loved and lost and continued to carry with gratitude rather than only grief. Amos heard it too, she thought. The way he looked at her was different in that moment, more open, as though something had moved that had been carefully placed and was now no longer needed in the same position. In February, on a day when the snow was blowing sideways, and the temperature was the kind of cold that made the air itself seem solid, Amos came in from checking the south fence at Susan's farm, which he had been managing along with his own ranch work since autumn with a naturalness that neither of them had formally acknowledged, and he sat down at the kitchen table and took off his gloves and looked at his hands for a moment and then looked at Susan. She was at the stove. She had her back to him. She could feel him looking the way you feel a change in the light. "Susan," he said. She turned. His face was stripped of the careful reserve he generally wore, the way a face looks when a person has decided they are done being careful. "I want to marry you," he said. "If you'll have me. I want to marry you and I want to be here with these boys and I want this to be what this is, if you're willing." She was quiet for a moment. The snow hit the window. The stove ticked. She walked to the table and she put her hand on his face, which surprised him, the directness of it, and she looked at him with all the honesty she had and she said, "I love you, Amos Bailey. I did not intend to and I was not expecting it, and I am very glad it happened." He covered her hand with his and pressed it, and his eyes were doing something she had never seen them do, something unguarded and clear. "Is that a yes?" he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "It is absolutely a yes," she said. He stood up from the table and he kissed her, which was the first time, and it was the kind of kiss that feels like an arrival, like reaching a place you have been traveling toward for a long time without knowing exactly where you were going. She put her arms around him and he held her the way he had that October afternoon in the kitchen, completely and without reservation. And outside the snow came down on the Kansas plains in the February dark, and inside the stove was warm and the house was full. Jacob, who was sitting in the corner with his surveying book and had seen the whole thing with the peripheral attention of a child who has learned to observe without appearing to observe, said nothing. He turned a page. There was the very faint sound of a smile being suppressed by a 9-year-old, with extensive experience in maintaining dignity. Thomas was not in the room and was therefore not available to shout in celebration, which was probably just as well. They told the boys together, the next morning, sitting at the breakfast table with oatmeal and fried salt pork and the clear cold February light coming in the windows. Amos said it plainly, that he had asked their mother to marry him and she had said yes, and that he wanted to be part of their family if they would have him, and that he knew no one replaced their father, and that he was not trying to, but that he cared about all 3 of them, and he intended to show that every day if they would let him. Thomas immediately said yes with an enthusiasm that rattled the windows and then asked if they were going to live on the ranch with the horses, to which Amos said they would figure that out together. Jacob was quiet for a moment, looking at his oatmeal, and then he looked up at Amos and said, "Were you married before?" "I was," Amos said. Her name was Clara. She died in 1874. Jacob considered this. Did you love her? Very much, Amos said. My father's name was Daniel, Jacob said. Mama loved him very much. I know, Amos said. So there's enough room, Jacob said, with the particular logical precision of a child who has worked something through, for all of them. Yes, Amos said. I think that's exactly right. Jacob looked at his mother, who was looking back at him with eyes that were doing their level best not to express what they were expressing. Then he looked at Amos. All right, he said. That's all right then. And he ate his oatmeal. They were married in April of 1879 in the small Methodist church on Millhaven's Main Street, on a morning when the prairie was coming into its spring extravagance, the grass going green and the wildflowers beginning along the roadsides, and the sky the particular shade of brilliant blue that only happens in Kansas in April. Susan wore her best dress, which Marta Hollies had helped her refashion from the gray wool into something more fitted with a lace collar that had been Marta's mother's. She wore her hair down, for the first time in a long time, pinned only at the sides, falling in auburn waves that the morning light appreciated thoroughly. Amos wore his good coat and a white shirt, and had combed his hair in a way that suggested considerable effort and partial success. He had a small wildflower in his buttonhole that Thomas had insisted on, a yellow one, and it sat there with considerable earnestness. The church was full, because Millhaven was the kind of town that takes a wedding as a community event, and also because a number of people had been watching Amos Bailey and Susan Thatcher through the winter with the interested attention of neighbors who had figured out what was happening before the principals had officially announced it. Tom Greer was there, and Nell Carpenter from the bakery, and Marta Hollies with her husband, and Pete Dunham and Cisco Rays and Rafter from the ranch, all three looking uncomfortable in their good clothes in the particular way of men who spend most of their time outdoors. Miss Prescott, the schoolteacher, was there, and Dora Hutchins from the Hutchins Ranch, who had tried to pay $2.25 for the quilt, sat in the third row looking perfectly pleased with herself for a reason no one could quite identify. Jacob stood up with Amos as something between a witness and a best man, having been invited by Amos with a seriousness that Jacob had received with equal seriousness. Thomas stood beside his mother and held the small bunch of prairie wildflowers she carried, which he did with only one small incident involving a bee, managed with considerable bravery. The minister, a Reverend Poole who had come to Millhaven 2 years prior, and who understood the particular spiritual landscape of the prairie without condescension, performed the ceremony with warmth and without excessive length, because he had the weather sense of the plains and he could feel the energy in the room, and he knew that what these people needed was the ceremony itself, not a lecture about it. When Amos said, "I will," and Susan said, "I will," and they looked at each other while they said it, Marta Hollies made a sound very close to a sob, and her husband patted her hand with the practiced efficiency of a man who has been married for 20 years. Thomas, having successfully managed the bee encounter, stood very straight and looked very proud. Jacob looked at his boots for most of this part and then looked up, and his expression was the most open and undefended that Susan had seen it since before Daniel died, and her heart did something enormous and silent in her chest. Amos kissed his wife in front of the church, and the church expressed its approval, and Pete Dunham cheered with a cowboy's wholehearted lack of restraint, and Cisco Rays said something in Spanish that made Rafter laugh, and Thomas threw the wildflowers in the air with a force that scattered them across 3 pews, and Jacob stood beside his mother and let himself be hugged, which he did not always permit, which told Susan everything she needed to know about where they were. The question of where to live had been resolved in March after several conversations of a practical and careful nature. The ranch was more established and more profitable and larger, and both boys had fallen in love with the horses and the open scope of the ranch land. But the farm was Susan's, Daniel's farm, the land he had broken, and it represented something that could not just be sold without consequence. They decided to keep the farm, lease the fields to a young farmer named Eli Marsh who was looking for land, and maintain the house for occasional use and as an inheritance for the boys. This arrangement satisfied Susan's sense of what she owed to Daniel's memory while also opening a new chapter, which was what she needed. The ranch house was larger than the farmhouse and somewhat less organized, having been managed by men only for several years. Susan arrived in it like the spring, which is to say with an energy and intention that rearranged things in ways that were clearly improvements and that none of the ranch hands dared argue with. The kitchen was reorganized within a week. A kitchen garden was established along the south wall within 2 weeks. By the end of April, the house felt like a home in the way it had not felt like a home since Clara's time, and Amos walked through it sometimes in the evening, with a quiet expression of something he would not have called wonder, but that came close. The boys settled into ranch life with a speed that Susan found impressive and slightly alarming. Jacob attached himself to Cisco Ray's with the focused apprenticeship of a child who has found something he wants to understand completely. And by July, he was riding as well as Cisco was willing to admit, and better than any 9-year-old had a right to be. Thomas was everywhere, simultaneously in the way of 6-year-olds, under every horse's feet and in every barn corner and on every fence post, and the ranch hands managed his presence with the resigned affection of men who have been annexed by a small person and have decided to go along with it. The ranch flourished in the summer of 1879. The cattle prices were good, and the new grazing land Amos had leased in spring proved excellent, and the accounts, now kept by Susan with a precision that Pete Dunham described as like having a bank on the kitchen table, but friendly, showed solid profit by September. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, which in southern Kansas in 1879 was a significant achievement. In the evenings they sat on the porch in the late light, Susan and Amos, sometimes talking and sometimes not, and the quiet was the kind that is made of contentment rather than absence. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and the plain stretched out beyond the fence line in the amber evening light. And there were nights when Susan thought that the distance between that October morning when she had carried the quilt to the market, unable to look at it, barely able to put one foot in front of the other, and this evening on this porch, was both enormous and very small, which is one of the stranger things about how a life can change. She told him about her mother in the summer evenings. She told him about Missouri and the household she had grown up in, strict and church-going but full of a particular warmth that her mother generated the way a good stove generates heat, without apparent effort. She told him about meeting Daniel at a church social when she was 21, and how he had been the most earnest person she had ever met, which was both charming and occasionally exhausting, and how she had loved him for it. She told him about the early years of the marriage when they were both learning how to be adults together, figuring out the particular grammar of a shared life, and the good years when the farm was productive and the boys were small and the future seemed manageable. She told him about the bad harvests and the slow erosion and Daniel's illness, and she told it plainly, the way she told most things, without flinching from the parts that were hard. He told her about Tennessee and the large, loud Bailey family that he had grown up in, 3 brothers and 2 sisters and parents who argued about everything and agreed about most things, which produced a household that was both exhausting and intensely alive. He told her about coming west with his brother Marcus, who had the same restlessness but less patience for staying in one place long enough to make it work, and how he had found the Kansas land and felt the quality of it under his boots and decided to stay. He told her about Clara, not more than he had said before, but in more detail, the texture of their particular life together, the small things he missed, the way grief had changed shape over the years from acute and blinding to something more like a permanent weather condition, present but no longer the only thing. Susan listened to all of it with the full attention she gave to everything, and she loved him more with each telling, not because the stories were particularly remarkable, but because they were his, the specific and unrepeatable history of the particular man she had married, and she was collecting them the way you collect the things that make up a person's meaning. In October, a year after she had paid the mortgage that had terrified her, Susan told Amos that she thought she was expecting. He went very still. She watched his face carefully, because she knew what this news meant for him, knowing what he knew about how it had gone the last time, and she saw all of that move across his face in the space of a few seconds, the joy and the fear arriving simultaneously, the way they do when the same thing that you want most is also the thing most capable of destroying you. She put her hand on his chest and felt his heart beating, fast and present. "I am strong," she said, "and Dr. Hennessy is a better doctor than the one you had before. And I have done this twice." He covered her hand with his. "I know," he said. His voice was not entirely level. "Are you happy?" she asked. He looked at her. All of it was in his face, the joy and the fear and the love and the history, and he said, "I am terrified, and I am the happiest I have ever been, both things." "Good," she said. "That seems right to me." She was right that she was strong. The pregnancy was not easy. The spring of 1880 was wet and cold, and she was tired in a way that she had not been with the boys. But she managed it with the practical efficiency she brought to everything, resting when she needed to rest and working when she could, keeping the accounts and the household and the boys' education, and generally declining to be managed by the situation rather than managing it. Amos was attentive in a way that she occasionally found overwhelming and more often found deeply, privately wonderful. He was up before her every morning. He made sure the stove was going before she came downstairs. He appeared in the kitchen garden without announcement and did the heavier work without being asked. He was tender in a way that came out sideways, in the practical forms that taciturn men express tenderness, and she received it in the spirit it was given, which was love made visible through action. Dr. Hennessy came out from Millhaven on the night of June the 5th, 1880, when Susan was 3 weeks past her time, and Amos had been wearing a track in the porch boards with his pacing for the previous 4 hours. Marta Hollies was inside with Susan, having ridden out when the word came, and the boys were in the kitchen with Pete Dunham, who had volunteered for this duty, without being certain exactly what it would involve, and was now dealing with Thomas's comprehensive series of questions about where babies came from with a level of improvisation that he would later consider the bravest thing he had ever done. Amos stood on the porch in the June night and listened to the sounds from inside the house and prayed in the inarticulate way of people who are not certain they know how to pray, but who are doing it anyway because there is nothing else available. He thought about Clara. He thought about the night she had died and the morning after and the way the world had looked entirely flat and colorless for months. He thought about Susan's voice saying, "I am strong," and he held on to that. The baby came at 11 at night. The baby cried, which was the most extraordinary sound Amos had ever heard in his life. He was in the room within seconds of being called, and Susan was there, tired and present and completely herself, with a small and emphatic person in her arms, and she looked up at him with those green eyes that were full of every possible thing and said, "A boy." Amos sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was red-faced and expressing himself vigorously, and he put one finger against the tiny fist, and the fist closed around it with the absolute automatic grip of a newborn, which is one of the most disarming things in human experience. And Amos Bailey, who had not cried since the day Clara died, sat on the edge of his wife's bed and put his face in his free hand, and cried with a thoroughness that he would never speak of and which Marta Hollies, gathering her things in the corner with remarkable tact, would describe to her husband as the most heartbreaking and beautiful thing she had ever seen. "He's all right," Amos managed. "He is perfect," Susan said with calm absolute certainty. "What do we name him?" Amos said, Susan looked at the baby and then at her husband. "I thought Daniel," she said. "If that's all right with you, Daniel Amos Bailey." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the small face. "That's all right with me," he said, and his voice had the quality of someone who has been given something they were not expecting and cannot yet fully account for. "That's more than all right." Jacob, when he was brought in to see his brother, stood at the edge of the bed with the expression of someone encountering a creature of a category he has not previously classified, and then said, quietly, "He is very small." "He will get bigger," Susan said. "I know," Jacob said. He looked at Amos. "That's good, that he has Daniel's name." "I thought so too," Amos said. Thomas, when he was brought in, immediately asked if the baby could ride horses, and no one who knew Thomas was surprised by this. The summer of 1880 was the best summer on the Bailey Ranch that anyone could remember, which Cisco Rays attributed to the regular meals, Pete Dunham attributed to the better accounting, and Rafter attributed to luck, not being a man who generally offered complex analysis. The cattle were fat and the prices were fair, and the kitchen garden was extravagant, and baby Daniel grew like a Kansas weed, which is to say fast and with intention, developing a set of opinions about the world before he was 3 months old that he expressed at a volume entirely disproportionate to his size. By autumn, the ranch had a particular quality that Amos stood back and looked at sometimes with a wondering that he kept to himself. The fence was sound and the barn was tight and the accounts were balanced, and his wife was singing in the kitchen in the early morning when she thought no one could hear her, which he could, which he had never told her, which was one of the private joys of the life they had built. Jacob was doing his lessons with Miss Prescott and had grown 3 inches, and had a new gravity to him that was not the false gravity of a child trying to be a man, but the genuine gravity of a boy who was growing into himself. Thomas was Thomas, which needed no further elaboration. The wedding quilt lived at the end of the bed, as it had since Susan had retrieved it from the farmhouse when they moved. It was spread there every night and folded back in the mornings. The lavender and rose and yellow hexagons faded but present. The grandmother's flower garden pattern her mother had spent a whole winter making. Sometimes Susan touched it as she made the bed, the way you touch something that carries memory, and she thought about her mother and about Daniel, and about the morning she had carried it to the market because there was no other way, and the way it had come back to her before sunrise in the hands of a man she had not yet learned to love but was already, without knowing it, beginning to. She thought about the chain of events that the quilt had started or not started, because she and Amos had existed in proximity for some time before that morning, but set in motion, the way a door opening sets a whole house of air in motion. The need that had led her to the market, and the instinct that had led him to the east fence, and the $3 he had paid, and the 2 hours of dark riding he had done to bring it back, and the 10 months of Fridays and the October afternoon in the kitchen, and the February proposal in a blizzard, and the April morning in the church, with Thomas throwing flowers at the congregation. All of it proceeding from that one morning, from need and kindness, and the particular way 2 damaged people can recognize each other across the distance of a market square. One evening in October of 1880, just past the anniversary of their marriage, Susan and Amos sat on the porch in the late light after supper. Daniel was asleep inside, a fact of which Amos had confirmed personally twice in the past 20 minutes. Jacob was reading by the lamp in the parlor. Thomas had been asleep since 8 o'clock, having spent the afternoon following Cisco Rays on a cattle sort and achieving a level of tiredness that had put him down without negotiation. The plains were golden in the evening light, the grass cured to its autumn color, the sky going from blue to amber above the far horizon. There was a hawk circling in the distance, riding the thermal above the pasture, that particular effortless circle that hawks do when they are neither hunting nor going anywhere but simply being what they are in the air they belong to. "Are you happy?" Susan asked. She asked it plainly, without qualification, the way she asked most things. Amos was quiet for a moment, in the good way, not the troubled way, but the way of a man who is taking the question seriously. He put his arm around her and she settled against him, and he looked out at the light on the plains and he said, "Yes, I am genuinely and completely happy." "Good," she said. "So am I." The hawk circled in the thermal. The light moved across the grass. Inside the house, Daniel Amos Bailey slept in his cradle, and Jacob read his book, and Thomas dreamed of horses, and the quilt lay spread across the bed where it had always been meant to be, in a house full of the particular warmth of people who have chosen each other and are not done yet. Amos pressed his lips to the top of his wife's head in the unhurried way of a man who knows he has time. "Tell me something," he said. "What?" "Tell me something good." Susan laughed, a low and genuine laugh, the kind that comes from a place that has had practice being happy and knows how to recognize it. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "Last spring you rode 15 miles in the dark before sunrise to leave a quilt on my doorstep." "That was good business," he said. "It was the best business I have ever heard of," she said. He was smiling. She could feel it against her hair. She put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder, and they sat together in the October evening on the Kansas plains and watched the light go out of the sky with the patience of people who know that the morning always comes. The stars came out one by one, as they always did, as they always had, as they always would, over the cattle on the slope and the barn and the tight sound fences, and the kitchen garden put to bed for winter, and the house full of sleeping children, over the graves of the people they had loved and lost and continued to carry, over the whole wide country still making itself into something in the year 1880, full of hardship and injustice and beauty and possibility, and the daily human work of building something worth keeping. The stars came out, and Amos and Susan sat under them and said nothing more, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was everything.